It is common for every human being to think of himself as the embodiment of virtue, a being incapable of cruelty or injustice. But what if the facade of piety hides something else, ready to burst out under certain circumstances? Some dark essence of which the individual is not even aware. The truth is that the division between good and evil is not an insurmountable abyss, but rather a shaky line that is closer to everyone than we would like to admit. In a world where difficult decisions and extreme situations test human morality to the limit, even the best intentions can lead to actions that previously seemed unthinkable. This disturbing but important aspect of human nature remains to be explored in order to understand what makes people cross the line that separates them from darkness, and how this temptation can be resisted. Has there ever been a question about the malleability of morality, that internal compass that guides actions? It can be nothing more than a leaf, driven by the wind of change, ready to change direction by external forces. The question of what makes a person good or bad is devoid of the simple answers we are accustomed to seek. Moral foundations that seem immutable can be destroyed in the blink of an eye. In certain circumstances, a person is capable of exhibiting behavior that goes against his or her own self-image. This phenomenon of moral fragility is what the renowned psychologist Philip Zimbardo calls situational metamorphosis, emphasizing that human nature is changeable and is shaped by external factors such as social pressure and the narratives used to justify certain actions. An example is the story of Ivan Frederick, an American soldier who, before serving in the scandalous Abu Ghraib prison, was no different from ordinary people. He was a man of principles, a loving father, and a patriot who believed in doing his duty to his country with honor. However, in an environment where violence became the norm, where dehumanization of prisoners and lack of moral control were practiced, he became an agent of unparalleled brutality. This case is a vivid illustration of how circumstances can radically change a person and make him or her do things that were previously unthinkable. Natural evil or a product of circumstance? The environment sometimes creates a gulf between our essence and our actions. In critical situations, moral principles become shaky, like writing in the sand. The famous Stanford prison experiment, which simulates torture, helps to make sense of this. Over the course of a few days, ordinary, mentally stable students immerse themselves in the roles of guards and prisoners in this simulation, which rapidly escalated into a real nightmare. Clad in uniforms symbolizing authority, the guards began to humiliate and insult the prisoners, demonstrating how easily ordinary people can cross the line. The question arises, would you have acted differently if you were in their shoes? But it is not only in extreme situations that this vulnerability manifests itself. Even minor everyday decisions demonstrate how context can affect us, often imperceptibly. Think back. Have you ever misappropriated someone else's belongings, justifying yourself on the basis of their insignificant value? Or perhaps you shared someone's cruel humor simply because everyone around you was laughing? Small concessions, seemingly innocuous at first glance, become the very stumbling blocks that trip us up on the road that leads inexorably to the moral collapse so often spoken of. This naturally raises a question of great importance. To what extent are our actions a true reflection of our essence, of our inner self? And to what extent are they merely the product of the environment in which we happen to exist? The surrounding context does not just influence us, it can transform us by changing our beliefs and principles. How is it possible to resist this invisible but all-powerful power of circumstances? Is there a way to prepare ourselves to resist external pressures? Or are we doomed to passively follow the will of the waves, losing our individuality? Why do we submit so easily? This question seems simple, but the answer can reveal one of the most depressing aspects of human nature. From a very young age, we are taught to respect and obey authority figures, parents, teachers, leaders. Such obedience is often the cornerstone of social order and stability. But what happens when the authority we have come to trust begins to demand that we act in ways that are contrary to our own moral principles and values? To what extent are we willing to compromise what we believe to be right and just in order to avoid open confrontation or to gain favor with an influential person? This question raises questions about the limits of our conscience and the price we are willing to pay for conformity. The Milgram experiment, a milestone in the history of psychology, raises a deeply troubling question. Imagine yourself in the participant's shoes. Clad in a strict white coat, you are instructed to subject another person to electric shocks. With each mistake, the voltage increases painfully, inexorably approaching the lethal mark. And now from behind the wall are cries of pain, pleas for mercy, but the authoritative voice of the scientist is adamant, continue, it is necessary for science. And amazingly, about 65% of the test subjects obeyed this terrible order, bringing the discharge to the maximum, even against the voice of their own conscience. What made them do this? The answer is simple and terrible: authority. What is it about this irresistible force that makes us go against our beliefs? It's all about how we perceive those in authority. When a person is in a high position, we tend to give them special knowledge and infallible morals. We begin to believe that our actions, even the most reprehensible ones, are justified because we are shifting responsibility onto their shoulders. Ultimately, if the undesirable happens, the responsibility falls not on the doers, but on the one who gave the order. This creates a gulf between actions and their consequences. Blind obedience is not limited to laboratory conditions. It permeates all of human history. From the soldiers of Nazi Germany, who justified their atrocities by simply following orders, to tragic events such as the Jonestown mass suicide, where hundreds of people took their own lives by obeying the orders of a charismatic leader. In all of these cases, what was at stake was not people's innate malice, but their inability to critically evaluate the instructions of their superiors. It is worth considering how often each of us has followed instructions without thinking, simply because they came from an authority figure. It may have been a simple task at work, but what if the situation turned out to be more serious? What if you have to do something that seems wrong, but you can't refuse? Would you have the courage to challenge the will of your superiors, or would the comfort of obedience be preferred? Power undoubtedly has enormous influence, but its omnipotence is a myth. Humanity can learn to recognize its manifestations, to question its legitimacy, and, if necessary, to resist it. Such an act requires courage and, more importantly, the realization of personal responsibility, because each individual bears the burden of consequences for his or her actions, regardless of who gave the order. The danger of blind obedience is multiplied when combined with the ominous phenomenon of dehumanization. When we strip others of their humanity in our perceptions, giving cruel orders becomes frighteningly easy. One has to wonder what mechanisms are in place to convince a person to treat his or her own kind inhumanely. The answer lies not only in the pressure of circumstances or the authority of orders, but also in the underlying processes associated with dehumanization. This process, which goes back centuries, is the key to transforming a living being into something devoid of human traits, unworthy of sympathy and compassion. As soon as we begin to perceive others as objects, potential threats, or faceless statistics, actions that previously seemed unthinkable become sinisterly justified and commonplace. Dehumanization is an insidious and elusive psychological trap, beginning with language and labeling that reduces the multifaceted nature of human beings to a single negative trait. Historical examples attest to the ubiquity of this phenomenon. In Nazi concentration camps, Jews were pejoratively referred to as rats, and during the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsi people were dubbed cockroaches. These words were not just descriptive, but shaped a new reality, allowing people to turn away from the horrific consequences, or even worse, to become complicit in the atrocities. Dehumanization is not limited to large-scale historical tragedies, but manifests itself daily in microaggressions and everyday situations. It is enough to remember how society stigmatizes certain groups of people by labeling them as lazy, bandits, or parasites. Such labels create an emotional detachment and moral abyss, allowing the suffering of these people to be ignored or excused. Have you ever wondered how often we use or accept these labels without questioning them? What if those labels were turned against you? Albert Bandura, a prominent psychologist, demonstrated a striking phenomenon in a simple experiment. He invited students to punish another group of people, but before doing so, some of the students heard derogatory characterizations of this group, comparing them to animals. The results were quite telling. Those who had been exposed to the negative labels administered significantly harsher punishments. Obviously, the negative definition alone was enough to diminish empathy and justify the abuse. Now it is worth thinking about interactions in the online space. Anonymity and distance encourage people to say things they would never dare to say in real life. The person on the other side of the screen is no longer perceived as a complete person, becoming a faceless avatar or profile. This digital dehumanization creates a fertile ground for bullying, harassment, and hate speech. This begs the question, have you ever had to participate in such a cycle, perhaps without even realizing it, and what could have prevented such a development? Dehumanization is a grave danger because it is subtle. You do not have to hate someone to commit cruel acts, you just have to stop seeing them as a human being. However, there is a way to counteract this phenomenon. It is necessary to bring to light what has hitherto been hidden in the shadows. In the fabric of human existence, each individual is much more than a mere mark or label. Behind each face lies a unique story, a tangle of complexities, and a unique life journey. Empathy, this powerful force, is the most effective weapon in the fight against dehumanization, but it requires a conscious effort on our part. It implies the ability to look beyond the surface and to grasp the true meaning behind the words we speak. Another factor that can multiply the destructive effects of dehumanization is the loss of a sense of personal responsibility. When a person is convinced that his or her actions have no consequences, or is safely shrouded in a veil of anonymity, evil is given fertile ground in which to flourish. It is worth pondering how some people find themselves capable of committing heinous acts without the slightest remorse. The answer to this question often lies precisely in the loss of personal responsibility, a psychological phenomenon that destroys the unbreakable link between our actions and their inevitable consequences. When a person develops the belief that he or she will not be punished for his or her actions, something truly dangerous happens. His or her moral framework, which normally serves as a reliable compass, begins to gradually erode. This concept is particularly disturbing in situations of anonymity or in groups where the sense of responsibility is eroded and dissolved in the collective consciousness. The phenomenon of collective behavior is a prime example of personality transformation in crowded environments. Individuals who in ordinary life would never resort to acts of vandalism or looting, in a crowd suddenly become participants in destructive actions. The illusion of impunity, the feeling of dissolution in the mass, where personal responsibility is leveled, creates a favorable ground for the manifestation of destructive impulses. Conscience and moral principles recede into the background, giving way to herd feeling and permissiveness. This psychological effect was clearly demonstrated in Philip Zimbardo's experiment. He left the car unattended in two different neighborhoods, in the disadvantaged Bronx, where the crime rate was particularly high, and in respectable Palo Alto, inhabited by representatives of the upper middle class. The results were striking. In the Bronx, the car was savagely vandalized within hours, while in Palo Alto it was left untouched. The difference in behavior was attributed to the sense of anonymity that prevailed in the Bronx and the high likelihood of being recognized in Palo Alto, which deterred potential vandals. Zimbardo's experiment showed conclusively that when people believe that their actions will go unnoticed and unpunished, they allow themselves to do things they would never do under the scrutiny of society. The same logic applies to the virtual space, where online anonymity creates the illusion of impunity and promotes the spread of destructive behavior. Hiding behind the masks of avatars and pseudonyms, individuals often allow themselves to say and do things that would be completely unthinkable in real life. This phenomenon, called online disinhibition, opens the door to violent remarks, threats, and lies that are easily justified because they seem disconnected from reality. However, we should not forget that the consequences of these actions are quite tangible for those on the other side of the screen. It begs a legitimate question. Have you ever thought about the impact your words have when you are seemingly protected by an impenetrable wall of anonymity? In addition to a sense of impunity, there is another factor that contributes to the dilution of responsibility: diffusion of blame. In hierarchical systems or large teams, it is often tempting to think, I only did my part and everyone else is responsible but me. This is what happened in situations like the Abu Ghraib abuse scandal, where soldiers justified their actions by simply following orders. Similar processes are observed in virtual communities, where dubious decisions are made collectively, which leads to a blurring of responsibility among group members. As a result, when no one is fully guilty, everyone becomes complicit. But is there an effective way to counteract this negative phenomenon? The bottom line is to be relentlessly aware of our actions, even when we seem to be acting out of sight of outsiders. Accepting responsibility is an act of true courage that requires a critical look not only at the directives we receive, but also at the narratives we use to justify our decisions. Language as a tool has tremendous power in perpetuating irresponsibility, skillfully masking morally questionable actions under a plausible pretext. When words become a shield to hide the truth of things, they transform the unacceptable into something palatable, thus keeping us from the abyss of cruelty into which circumstances push us. Salvation lies in conscious choice. Resistance to evil is not a gift of fate or an innate talent, but a skill that we hone daily, step by step, through small acts that affirm our humanity and responsibility. Conscious choice is an act of courage because it often involves confronting conventional wisdom. Consider the participants in Milgram's experiment who refused to continue with the electroshock experiment. They did not possess supernatural strength or wisdom, but chose to take responsibility in defiance of the pressure of authority. Their example proves that true heroism lies not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to face it. This conscious choice also manifests itself in everyday situations, when we choose to do good regardless of the circumstances. How often have you witnessed something wrong and chosen not to intervene? Whether it is a harsh word in a conversation, or even a small thing like excessive change in a store, every such circumstance is a test. A chance to demonstrate our moral fortitude in a world where moral principles are often disregarded. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo is convinced that heroism is not the domain of a select few or exceptional moments. On the contrary, heroism, in his view, is a choice that anyone can make when others fail to act. A prime example of this is Wesley Altman, known as the hero of the New York subway. After noticing a man faint and fall on the tracks, he rushed to his aid without wasting a second, covering the victim with his body as the train passed. Wesley did not seek glory as a hero. He simply acted according to his conscience in a critical situation. However, such a choice is not always easy and often requires going against conventional norms, challenging the decisions of superiors, or withstanding a barrage of criticism. So, how can you prepare yourself to make such a decision at the right moment? The key lies in constant observation and development of awareness of your actions and their consequences. This involves being critical of habitual scenarios, challenging unfair instructions, and above all, realizing that every decision, even the smallest one, shapes our personality. Conscious choice is rooted in the ability to penetrate the essence of human nature, to see behind the mask of well-being all the difficulties and wounds that each person carries. Without this empathy, without this deep connection, choice becomes a soulless act dictated only by considerations of personal gain or subconscious fear. When we look at those around us, recognizing their vulnerability and embracing their humanity in its entirety, we awaken to the realization that we are all on the same path in life, regardless of our differences. This simple but profound realization can dramatically change the way we perceive the world, and as a result, our decisions.